The summer I was 12. In 1994, my parents rented a small cabin on a wooded road outside Hot Springs, North Carolina, for the month of July. My father was a high school history teacher and my mother was a librarian, and both of them had June and July off, and every summer they did some version of the same thing. They took my younger brother and me somewhere quiet for a few weeks, the kind of place with a screen porch and a creek and a public swimming hole down the road, and they read on the porch and we ran around in the woods until we were tired enough to sleep. That summer, they had picked a small two-bedroom cabin on a piece of property called the McElroy Place, off a county road that climbed up into the hills above the French Broad River. The cabin had been built in the 50s as a hunting cabin and had been converted into a summer rental in the late 70s. It had a screen porch on the front, two small bedrooms in the back, a wood stove in the front room that we never lit, and an old Frigidaire that hummed loud enough to mask the night sounds. The rent was $300 for the month. My parents paid in cash. My brother was 8, I was 12. We were each going to be allowed to walk to the swimming hole alone if we went together. And that was the kind of small, adult-feeling thing that I had been looking forward to for 3 months. The cabin sat on about an acre of cleared land, at a slight bend in the road. Down the road from us, in the direction of the swimming hole, there was nothing for about a quarter of a mile. The trees came right up to the gravel. Up the road from us, in the direction of town, there was the same. The whole stretch felt private in the way those Appalachian roads feel private, where you cannot tell whether the next driveway is 50 yards or a mile away because the forest swallows everything. The first morning, after we had unpacked, my brother and I walked the road down to the swimming hole the way our parents had told us we could, and that was the first time I saw the house with no windows. I want to describe it carefully, because I have been over the picture of it in my head 1,000 times since, and the picture has not gotten any softer. The house sat about 100 feet back from the road, set into a small clearing in the trees, with a short gravel driveway running up to it. It was a small house, maybe 900 square feet by the look of it, single story. The walls were cinder block gray, cinder block, the kind you see at the back of a hardware store, painted in a faded flat gray that had long ago given up holding its color. The roof was tin, sagging a little at one corner. There was a small porch on the front, made of wood that had not been painted in a long time, with a single metal folding chair on it. There was a propane tank in the side yard, the white kind on a concrete pad. There was a single short metal pipe sticking up out of the roof, and a second short metal pipe coming out of the back of the building. That was it. That was the whole house. There were no windows, none. Not a single one on the front, not on the side I could see. Not on the back. The walls were solid cinder block all the way around. There was a front door, wooden, painted the same flat gray as the walls, with a brass knob and no glass, and presumably there was a back door, and there was the propane tank, and there were the two short pipes for venting whatever needed to be vented. There was nothing else. I want you to understand that I had grown up around country houses. I had been to my grandmother's place in Madison County 100 times. I had been to the homes of my father's old college friends in Cherokee. I had seen a lot of small cinder block houses in those hills, and I had seen people do all sorts of things to make a small house their own. Boarded up porches, plywood over a bay window, plastic over winter glass, lean-tos built off the back. I had never seen a house with no windows at all. I do not mean a house with the windows boarded up. I mean a house that had been built without them. There was no frame that had been filled in. There was no patch in the cinder block where a window had been bricked over. The walls were continuous. The blocks ran in even rows from the foundation to the eaves. The house had been put up that way on purpose, by somebody who had wanted nothing to look out of and nothing to look in. I asked my father about it that evening on the porch. He had been reading a paperback. He looked up at me when I said it. He thought for a second. He said, "Some people just like their privacy, son. There's all kinds of folks in these hills." He went back to his book. I did not ask my mother. I knew, by the way my father had said it, that the question was closed. I went to bed. The first time I saw the man was on the third day. I was walking down the road with my brother on the way to the swimming hole, and we came around the bend, and he was sitting on the porch of the house, with no windows, in the metal folding chair. It was about 4 in the afternoon. He was an older man, maybe 60, maybe 65, with thinning gray hair combed straight back and a long, thin face that had been outside for most of its life. He was wearing a short-sleeved button-down shirt, the color of pale blue chambray, and dark trousers, and brown leather work shoes that had been polished. He was sitting straight up in the chair, both feet flat on the porch boards, both hands resting flat on his thighs. He was facing the road. He was not reading. He was not drinking. He was not smoking. He was just sitting. He turned his head slightly when we walked past. He nodded once. We nodded back, the way my mother had taught us to nod at neighbors. He did not say a word. We kept walking. I saw him 3 more times in the daytime in the next 2 weeks. Each time, he was on the porch in the metal folding chair. And each time, he was wearing the same pale blue chambray shirt and the same dark trousers and the same brown shoes. Each time, his hands were flat on his thighs and his feet were flat on the porch and he was facing the road. Each time, he nodded at me as I walked past. Each time, he did not speak. I noticed, around the 2nd week, that he came out on the porch every evening at 7 on the dot, not 5 before, not 5 after. At 7, he came out the front door with the metal folding chair already in his hand, set it down in the same spot every time, and sat. He was still sitting there when we went to bed at 10. I never saw him leave. I asked my father whether he ever saw the man go back inside, and my father, who had taken to walking down to the road every evening to smoke a single cigar after supper, said he had never seen him go inside either. The man was sitting there at 7 in the evening every night, and the man was sitting there at 10 o'clock when we shut off our lights, and the man was not there in the morning. And that meant either he was sitting on his porch all night, every night, or he was getting up sometime after we slept and going inside without anyone seeing him do it. The 3rd week we were there, I woke up at 3 in the morning. I am a deep sleeper. I do not, as a rule, wake up in the middle of the night. The cabin had only the 2 bedrooms, and my brother and I shared the smaller one, and I had a window above my bed that looked out onto the road. The blinds had been broken when we moved in, and my father had not bothered to fix them, and I had been sleeping with the window cracked because the cabin did not have air conditioning and the nights, even up there, had been warm. What woke me was the sound of nothing. I want to try to explain this. There had been a steady, soft chorus of crickets and tree frogs and night insects every night since we had been at the cabin, the kind of mountain night sound you stop hearing after the first day. And I woke up because the chorus had stopped. The whole woods around the cabin had gone silent. I lay in bed for a second with my eyes open, listening. The frigid air hummed in the kitchen. Nothing else. No cricket. No frog. No moth at the screen. I sat up. I looked out the window above my bed. There was a small orange light on the road in front of the cabin. I want to walk through what I saw because I have been over it many times since. The light was small, the size of the burning tip of a cigarette. It was about waist high. It was moving along the gravel road, very slowly, in our direction. It was approaching from the direction of the house, with no windows. It moved at maybe a quarter of a normal walking pace. It bobbed slightly, in the way the tip of a cigarette bobs when somebody is walking with the cigarette in his hand. There was no flashlight. There was no headlamp. There was no truck. There was just the small orange light, in the dark, on the gravel road, coming toward us. The light stopped at the edge of our yard. I want to tell you what stopping looked like. The light came up the road at its slow pace and reached the place where our gravel driveway met the county road, and it stopped, and it stayed in one place. It did not advance into the yard. It did not retreat back down the road. It simply stayed there, hovering at about waist height, at the very edge of the property line. And every once in a while it brightened slightly, the way the tip of a cigarette brightens when somebody draws on it, and then dimmed again, and then brightened, and then dimmed. I lay in bed and I watched it. I want to tell you I lay there for a few minutes, and then I went back to sleep. I did not. I lay there with my eyes on that small orange light at the edge of our yard, and I did not move, and I did not call for my parents, and I did not wake my brother, and the light brightened and dimmed at slow, regular intervals at the edge of our yard. And I watched it, and I did not have words for what I was watching, and I was 12 years old, and I was scared in a way I did not know I could be, and I lay there. The light went out, finally, at what my watch said later was 3:43. I had checked it, in the moonlight, when I had first sat up, and it had said 3:05. The light went out, and it did not move down the road, and it did not move up the road, and it did not move into our yard. It just went out. There was a long pause. maybe a minute, in which the woods stayed silent. Then the crickets started up again, in twos and threes, and within another minute the chorus was back the way it had been before, and the night settled down around the cabin, and I lay in bed and I waited for my heart to slow, and somewhere after that I fell asleep. In the morning, my father found the circle. I want to describe this carefully, because the picture is the part I have not been able to put down. My father had gone out to start the coffee on the camp stove on the porch, the way he did every morning, and he had walked out to the gravel drive to retrieve the newspaper that the McElroys had a kid drop off as part of the rental, and on his way back, at the edge of our yard, where the gravel of the driveway met the gravel of the road, he had seen the cigarette butts. He had stood looking at them for a long second. Then he had called me and my brother out. There were 12 of them. They were arranged in a perfect circle, the size of a dinner plate, on the flat patch of gravel just outside our property line. They were all the same brand. They were a brown filter cigarette I did not recognize at 12, and that my father, examining one of them, said was a brand called Benson and Hedges, that he had not seen anyone smoke since the 70s. They were all smoked down to the filter. They were all extinguished. They had been pressed out on the gravel and then placed, one by one, in the circle. The points of the filters all pointed inward, toward the center of the circle. The ash ends pointed outward, toward our cabin. My father stood there for a long time. My brother started to ask what they were. My father told him to go back to the porch. My brother went. My father knelt down. He looked at the circle from a few feet away, the way you look at a thing you do not want to disturb. He stood up. He went back to the cabin. He did not eat breakfast. He took my mother into the bedroom and closed the door for 10 minutes. They came out, and my mother had the look on her face I knew was the look she had when she was being calm for our sakes. My father told my brother and me that we were going to drive into Asheville for the day. We were going to go to the Folk Art Center. We were going to have lunch at a barbecue place he had read about. We did. We came back at 5. The circle had been swept away with a push broom, and the gravel raked smooth. The metal folding chair was on the porch of the house, with no windows at 7, the same as every other night. The man was sitting in it. He nodded at my father when my father walked down the road to smoke his cigar. My father nodded back. Neither of them spoke. We left the next morning. My father told the McElroys he had been called back to school for a meeting he had forgotten. He paid them for the full month. He did not ask for any of the money back. We packed the car at 6 in the morning. The man was not on his porch as we drove past. The metal folding chair was on the porch in its usual spot. The chair was empty. I looked back through the rear window of the car as we passed, and I am almost 43 years old now, and I have wondered for 31 years whether the chair I saw in the rear view was the same chair he had been sitting in, or whether it was a chair that had been put out in his place, because the angle of the chair, in my memory, was wrong. It was facing not the road, but our cabin, the place where we had spent the month, and the small front door of the house with no windows behind the chair was, I am almost certain, just slightly open. We moved to a small holler outside Hazard, Kentucky. The summer I was 32, into a double-wide on 3 acres, at the end of a gravel road that climbed up off the county pavement and dead-ended at our property line. My husband had taken a job as a maintenance manager at one of the regional hospitals down in Hazard, and I was working remotely as a medical coder for a company in Lexington, and we had decided, after almost a decade in apartments in 2 different cities, that what we wanted next was quiet. The double-wide had been on the market for almost a year before we found it. It had been built in 1996. It sat on a low rise with the front porch facing west, toward a long view of layered ridges, and the back porch facing east, toward a steep, wooded slope that ran up into a tract of timber company, land 60,000 acres of unbroken, the forest that the company had been logging in small parcels for 50 years, and that ran, with no road through it, all the way to the next county. The property line behind us was a fence post and a wire that disappeared into a stand of yellow poplar. There were 3 acres of cleared land in front of the double-wide, room for a vegetable garden and a small barn and the gravel turnaround where we kept the truck. The asking price had been $92,000. We had paid $88,000. The closing had been on a Friday in May. We had moved in the next weekend. The neighbor on the next ridge over was an older woman named June. I want to tell you about June because she is the part that does not let me sleep 15 years later, on certain summer nights when the windows are open. Her property line abutted ours on the south side of the holler, and her house, a small white frame house with a tin roof and a screened porch on the front, sat on a clearing on the next ridge, maybe 400 yards from our double wide, as the crow flies, but a quarter-mile by road because the road wound around the holler. We could not see her house from our double wide because of the trees. We could see her porch lights through the trees at night. We could see the white of her clapboard, in patches, when the wind moved the leaves. She had waved at us, the day we moved in, from the front porch of her house. She had been a small woman, thin, in a faded floral house dress, with white hair pulled back. She had stood at her porch railing and lifted her hand at us, and we had lifted our hands back, and that had been the only time, in the 4 months we lived in that holler, that we ever saw her in person. The man who delivered our propane the first time, a thin, older man named Buell who worked for a company down in Hazard, asked me, the day he came out to top off the tank, who lived next door. I told him a woman named June. He nodded slowly. He said he had known June and her husband in high school, before her husband had died, and that she had been a sweet girl. He said she did not get out anymore. He said she had her groceries delivered by a niece on Wednesdays, and that was about all the going on at her place. I asked him whether there was anything I should know about her. He looked at me a long second. He said, "She's no trouble, honey. She just keeps to herself." He capped the propane fill and got back in his truck and drove off down the gravel road. The summer was hot and quiet in the way summers in those mountains are. We worked. My husband left the house at 6 in the morning and came home at 5:30. I worked from the small office I had set up off the kitchen. We ate supper on the back porch, looking at the wooded slope behind the double wide when the temperature dropped at sundown. We listened to the cicadas. We watched the fireflies come up out of the field in front of the house in the long blue dusk. We were happy, in a quiet way, in a way I have not been happy since. The first week of August, I started hearing the whistle. I want to describe it carefully because the cadence is the part I have not been able to put down. It came at about 10 in the evening, on a Wednesday. The first time. We had been sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine each, the way we did most nights, and the cicadas had been loud the way they got at that hour, and I heard the whistle through the cicadas. It came from the direction of June's house. It was the kind of whistle a woman uses to call a dog in. 2 short notes and 1 long note. The kind of whistle you make through your teeth, with your fingers. The kind a country woman could throw a quarter-mile through still air without breaking a sweat. It came once. There was a pause. 5 minutes later, by the clock on the back porch, it came again. 2 short, 1 long. Same pitch, same length. The cicadas had not stopped. The whistle had cut through them. 5 minutes after that, it came a third time. 2 short, 1 long, and then it was over. There was no fourth. My husband had not heard the first whistle. He had been on the phone with his brother in Lexington. He had heard the second and the third. He looked over at me when the third one came. He said, "Was that her?" I said I thought so. He said, "Does she have a dog?" I said I had not seen one. We finished our wine. We went to bed. It happened again the next night. Wednesday and Thursday, then Friday, then Saturday. By the end of the second week of August, the whistle had become a part of our evenings. 10 o'clock. 2 short, 1 long. 5-minute pause. 2 short, 1 long. 5-minute pause. 2 short, 1 long. 3 times, every night, at the same hour, with the same intervals, with the same intensity. We started listening for it. I would set down my glass of wine when 10 o'clock came around, and I would wait, and the cicadas would be loud, and the whistle would come through them, and we would look at each other across the porch and not say anything. And 5 minutes later it would come again, and then it would be done for the night. I asked Buell about her the next time he came out, in the third week of August. I said, "Does June have a dog?" He stopped what he was doing, and he looked at me. He said, "What kind of dog?" I said I did not know, that I had been hearing a whistle from her place at night that sounded like she was calling one. He set down his pressure gauge. He took off his cap. He wiped his forehead. He said, "Honey, June has not had a dog in 11 years. Her old hound died in the spring of 2014. She buried him in the backyard, under the apple tree. She did not get another. He looked at me. He said, "It killed her, that dog dying. They had had him 15 years. He was the last thing of her husband's. In a way, her husband had brought the dog home as a puppy in '99. She said losing the dog was worse than losing him. She had cried about it on her porch for a week." Buell put his cap back on. He said she took to whistling for him sometimes, in the evenings. She did it the first year. She did it the second year. People thought she had lost her mind. But the way I see it, she had lost her husband and her dog inside of 3 years, and she was a woman of 75 at that point. And you do what you have to do to keep your husband and your dog with you. He picked up his pressure gauge. He said, "The local kids steer clear of her place at night. They do not like to walk past it after dark. Folks just leave her alone." I asked him whether the whistle was still her after 11 years. He looked at me a long second. He said, "Honey, June is 86 years old. June cannot whistle like that anymore. June cannot whistle 2 short and 1 long that you can hear from a quarter mile away. June whistled like that when she was 60. June whistles a soft little whistle now that you would not hear from her own porch. I have been on her porch with her last spring. I know what June sounds like." He paused. "I am not telling you what is whistling, ma'am. I am telling you it ain't June." He got back in his truck. He drove off down the gravel road. I went back into the house. I did not tell my husband the conversation that day. I did not know how to tell him. I did not know what I would have been telling him. The whistle came that night. 2 short, 1 long. 5-minute pause. 2 short, 1 long. 5-minute pause. 2 short, 1 long. 3 times. The way it always came. We had been sitting on the back porch in the dark with the citronella candle burning and a beer each. My husband had a small smile on his face, the way he always had after the 3rd whistle. The way you smile when something has become a kind of running joke. I did not smile back. He noticed. He asked me what was wrong. I told him about Buell. I told him about the dead hound. I told him about June being 86 and not able to whistle that way anymore. He looked at me for a long time across the dark of the porch. He said, "Then who is whistling?" I said I did not know. We started keeping the windows shut at night, even when the cicadas slowed and the air cooled. The whistle came through anyway, muffled but clear. 2 short, 1 long. 5-minute pause. 2 short, 1 long. 5-minute pause. 2 short, 1 long. 3 times. Every night. In the 2nd week of September, I made myself walk down the gravel road around 8 in the evening, in the long blue dusk, before the whistle started. I wanted to see June's house. I wanted to see whether she was on the porch. I wanted to see whether somebody else was on the porch. I walked the quarter mile of gravel road that ran around the holler, and I came up on June's place from the front. The house had its porch light on. The screen porch was empty. There was no person on it. The front door of the house was closed. There was a single lamp on inside the front room. I could see, through the lace curtain, the back of an upholstered chair and the curve of an arm in the chair, draped along the armrest. The arm was thin. It was the arm of an old woman in a long sleeve. It was not moving. I watched the curtain for a long second. The arm did not move. The lamp did not flicker. June's house was as still as a photograph. I walked around the house, on the gravel of her driveway. Slowly, I did not see anyone in the backyard. There was an apple tree at the back, gnarled and old, with a small rough cairn of stones at the base of it that I assumed was where the hound was buried. There was a clothesline. There was a rusted swing set that had not been used in a long time. There was a small concrete patio off the back of the house. There was nobody on the patio. There was nobody anywhere. I walked back home. I told my husband about the arm in the chair. I told him I thought June was alive but did not move much. I told him I was not going back over there. The whistle came at 10 that night, the way it always did. 2 short, 1 long. 5-minute pause. 2 short, 1 long. 5-minute pause. 2 short, 1 long. 3 times. We moved out at the end of October. My husband took a transfer to the same hospital company's branch up in Lexington. We told the realtor we wanted to be closer to my mother, who had not been well, which was true, and which had nothing to do with why we left. We rented an apartment in a complex on a busy street with a parking lot and floodlights and other doors 30 feet from ours. The double wide on the 3 acres outside Hazard sat on the market for almost 2 years before it sold. The price kept coming down. I checked the listing once, near the end. There were photos in the listing of the back porch. The view from the porch in the photos was the same view we had had, the wooded slope, the small clearing, the line of yellow poplar, and I sat at my kitchen table in Lexington, and I looked at those photos for a long time. I never went back to that holler. I do not know whether June is still alive. She would be 101 if she were. I do not know whether the whistle still comes at 10 o'clock every night. I do not know whether somebody else moved into the double wide and sat on the back porch and listened to the cicadas in the long blue dusk and heard, at 10 on the dot, the 2 short and 1 long of a country woman calling something in. I do not know whether they figured out what the whistle was or whether they did what we did, which was to listen to it for 4 months and then move out and to leave it for the next people to puzzle over and to never speak about it again. I do not know what comes when an old woman whistles for an old dog for 11 years in a row. I do not know whether the dog answers. I do not know whether something else does. I know that I learned, that summer in that holler, that there are some sounds you live next to and never solve, and that the not solving is part of how you stay alive in those mountains, and that I have not, in the 15 years since, ever been able to whistle 2 short notes and 1 long without my mouth going dry and stopping me at the second short. My husband and I bought a small cabin on a private cove on Lake Santitla outside Robbinsville, North Carolina, in the summer of 2017. We had been married 11 years, and we had no children, and we had been saving for almost a decade for a piece of property that would be ours. And the cabin had come on the market in March at a price we could just barely make work, and we had jumped on it. It was a 1-story cedar-sided cabin built in 1978, set on a 1/4 acre of cleared lot that sloped down to the water, with a small wooden dock at the bottom of the lawn, and a screened porch on the lakeside and a wood stove in the front room. The cove it sat on was a narrow finger of water tucked into a piece of the lake that the realtor had told us was almost unique to the area. Only 2 houses on it. No public access, no road in to the far side, no other cabins for half a mile in either direction. The other house on the cove belonged to an older couple. The realtor had told us their names, but I have, in 7 years, deliberately forgotten them. I am going to call them the Hollises because that was not their name, and I do not want to put their actual name on a page where someone could find it. We met the Hollises exactly once. It was the day we closed on the cabin. We had driven the 4 hours up from Charlotte, signed the papers at the realtor's office in town, picked up the keys, and we had stopped at the small marina at the head of the lake on the way to our place to buy a few things: a 6-pack of beer, a bag of charcoal, a quart of milk for the morning. The marina was a small wooden building with a covered slip and a gas pump on a floating dock and a Coca-Cola cooler on the front porch. And as we were paying for our things, the man behind the counter looked past us through the screen door and said, "Y'all are gonna want to meet your new neighbors. They are right out there." We turned around. There was an older couple on the dock, the man maybe in his late 60s, the woman a few years younger, both of them in tan windbreakers and khakis, both of them tan in the way people who spend a lot of time on the water are tan. The woman had short white hair, and the man was clean-shaven with thinning gray hair combed back. They were, I will tell you, an attractive older couple. They had the kind of bearing that made you think they had probably been good-looking in their youth, and had stayed in shape, and had on average done well in life. They were the kind of older neighbors you would have hoped to have on a lake. They came up the dock to meet us when the man behind the counter waved them over. They smiled. They shook our hands. The woman said how pleased she was that the cabin had finally sold, that it had been on the market a long time, that the previous owners had been a sweet older couple who had moved to a retirement community in Asheville and had not been able to keep up with the place. The man told us they had been on the cove for 31 years. He told us the fishing was good. He told us where the base came in close along the rocks at dusk, and where the pontoon boats from the public side of the lake never bothered to come, and where the channel got too shallow at the back of the cove for a deeper hull. He gave us their phone number on a small piece of paper. He told us if we ever needed anything to call. He shook my husband's hand again. He shook mine. They wished us well. They walked back down the dock to a small aluminum boat with a small outboard motor on the back, and they got in, and the man started the motor, and they pulled out of the slip and motored slowly down the lake toward the cove. We watched them go. We carried our beer and our charcoal back to the truck. We drove out to the cabin. I want to tell you that the first weekend was happy. It was. We unpacked. We made up the bed in the small back bedroom with sheets we had brought from home. We grilled hamburgers on the deck and ate them on the screened porch as the sun went down behind the ridge across the cove, and the lake went pink and then gold and then dark, and the loons called. We saw the Hollis's house, of course. It sat directly across the cove from ours, maybe 200 yards as the crow flies, on the same kind of cleared lot sloping down to a small wooden dock. Their cabin was a little larger than ours, with a deeper roofline and a wider screened porch, and it was painted the soft brown a stained cedar goes after a couple of decades. The two houses faced each other across the water. From our screened porch, in good light, you could see their porch. You could see, faintly, the silhouettes of two metal chairs at the end of their dock. The first time we saw them on their dock was the second evening of that weekend. We were sitting on our screened porch with glasses of wine. The sun was going down. The cove had gone quiet. Across the water, the Hollises were sitting in two metal chairs at the end of their dock, side by side, facing across the cove. My husband lifted his glass at them in a small wave. They did not wave back. He said, quietly, maybe they can't see us. It was the kind of small thing that, in the moment, you talk yourself out of. The light was going, the porch was screened. They might not have been able to make out a small wave from across 200 yards of water. We watched them. They sat in their chairs. They did not get up. They did not turn their heads. When the light got too low to see, I went inside to start supper. My husband stayed on the porch a few minutes longer. When he came in, he said, "They are still there." I asked whether they had moved. He said, "No." The second weekend we drove up was a Friday in late June. We arrived at the cabin around 6 in the evening. We unpacked. We made supper. We took our wine glasses out to the screened porch around 8. The Hollises were on their dock, in their two metal chairs, facing across the cove. They were facing our house. I want you to understand what I mean by that. The Hollises' dock pointed straight out across the cove toward our cabin, and the two metal chairs at the end of the dock were placed side by side at the end of the dock, with the chairs facing the same direction, which was the direction the dock pointed, which was toward us. Anyone sitting in those chairs would have been looking, if they were looking forward, at our house, not at the lake to the left or right, not at the wooded slope behind us. At our house, the two of them sat in the chairs from the time we sat down on the porch to the time it got too dark to see, and they did not move once, and we did not see them get up to go inside. The third time we drove up was the Saturday of the 4th of July weekend. I had told my husband on the drive that I wanted to walk down our lawn to the dock when we got there, and wave at the Hollises and call out across the water and start a friendly call and response, the way lake people do. The neighborhood needed an icebreaker. We were going to be neighbors for a long time. I did not want to spend the next 30 years of summer weekends with two people across the cove who did not wave back. We arrived at 4 in the afternoon. The lake was busy. There were boats out. There were children swimming off other docks down the lake. The Hollises were sitting in their two metal chairs at the end of their dock, facing our house. I walked down our lawn to our dock. I waved. I called out across the water. I said, "Hello, good to see you again." I was loud enough that two boats passing through the cove looked at me. The Hollises did not wave back. They did not call back. They did not move at all. I stood at the end of our dock for what was probably a minute and felt like a long time. They sat in their chairs. They did not look at me. They looked at our house, behind me. They looked at the cabin. The cabin was 120 feet behind me, up the lawn. They were looking past me at it. I went back up to the cabin. I told my husband. He took it in for a minute, and then he said he was going to drive into Robbinsville and buy a pair of binoculars, and he did. And he came back 40 minutes later with a pair of cheap 8x20 Bushnells from the hardware store, and he sat on the screen porch with them around 6 in the evening, and he focused them across the cove at the Hollises, and he watched the Hollises through the lenses for what was probably 4 or 5 minutes. Then he set the binoculars down on the small wicker table beside his chair, very slowly, the way a man sets down a thing he does not want to drop, and he stood up, and he said in a voice I had not heard him use, "We are going inside. Now." I stood up. I went inside. He followed. He shut the porch door behind us. He shut the door from the porch into the front room. He locked it. He went around the cabin and pulled every curtain on the lakeside windows, and then on the side and back windows too. He did not turn on any lights. We sat on the couch in the front room in the dimming light, with our wine glasses on the coffee table, and we did not speak for a while. He was breathing the way you breathe when you have been holding it. He told me, finally, what he had seen through the binoculars. He told me they had not been blinking. He told me he had focused on the woman first, because she was a little closer to the binoculars center. He had watched her face. The face had been pointed across the cove at our house, the way it always was. The face had not moved. He had counted, he said, while he watched. He had decided he was going to count to 31, the number of years they had been on the cove. He had counted. By 12, he had realized he had not seen her blink. By 20, he had been sure of it. He had kept counting. At 31, he had moved the binoculars to the man on her left, and he had counted to 31 again. The man had not blinked either. He had moved the binoculars back to the woman. He had counted to 31 a third time. The woman had not blinked. He had been holding the binoculars on her, he said, for almost 5 minutes by that point. He told me her eyes had been wet, the way eyes are wet, and they had been moving the small natural movements eyes make when they are looking at something, small adjustments. A tiny flick now and then, and they had not closed. They had not blinked, not the man, not the woman, not in 5 minutes. He told me there was no way for an eye to be wet and to be moving and to not blink in 5 minutes. He told me he had set down the binoculars when he had realized what he was looking at. He told me he could not unsee it. We did not eat supper that night. We did not go back out on the porch. We stayed in the front room with the lights off and the curtains closed, and we listened to the loons, and we listened to whatever sounds were coming across the water from the cove, and we slept poorly. We left at 6 the next morning. We drove back to Charlotte without breakfast. We did not stop at the marina. We listed the cabin the next week. The realtor was confused. We had been in it for less than 3 months. We told her my mother was sick. The cabin sold the following spring to a young family from Atlanta. They paid almost $10,000 less than we had paid for it. We took the loss. We have not been back to Lake Santitla. We have not been back to that part of North Carolina. I have, sometimes, in the 7 years since, looked the cove up on a satellite map. The Hollis's cabin is still there. There are 2 metal chairs visible on their dock, on the satellite image, facing across the cove toward the cabin we used to own. I do not know whether the family from Atlanta still has the place. I have not looked them up. I do not want to. I do not know what the Hollises were watching for in those years before we bought the cabin, and I do not know whether they are still watching for it. And I do not know whether the family from Atlanta is what they were watching for, or whether we were, or whether neither of us was, or whether they have simply been sitting in those chairs at the end of that dock for 31 years, and now 38, looking across the water at whatever is in the cabin they are looking at, waiting on something that has not yet come. The summer my husband and I rented a small farmhouse outside Marion, Virginia, was the summer of 2014, and it was the year we had decided, after 7 years in a townhouse in Charlotte, that what we wanted to do for at least a season was live somewhere quieter. My husband had been able to negotiate 4 months of remote work from his job in finance, and I was a freelance copywriter and could work anywhere, and we had decided that what we wanted was to spend May through August in the Blue Ridge, in a place with land. We had found the farmhouse on a small rental site that mostly listed cabins. It was a 1.5-story white clapboard farmhouse, built in 1924, on 5 acres at the end of a gravel road off Route 16 inches. Smith County. It had a wraparound porch and a small barn and a tin roof, and original wide plank hardwood floors. The rent was $850 a month. The listing had said the property came with a part-time groundskeeper who lived in a small trailer at the back of the lot, and that he was included in the lease, and that he would handle the lawn and small repairs, and would otherwise leave us alone. We had thought that was a charming detail. We had liked the idea of an old man on a tractor on Saturdays. The owner of the farmhouse was a woman named Linda Bentley, who lived in Wytheville and who had inherited the property from her father in the early 2000s. We had met her once. On the morning we took the keys, on the porch of the farmhouse, she had been a thin woman in her late 50s, with the careful manners of an older South. She had walked us through the house and shown us the breaker box, and the well pump, and the way the back screen door had to be lifted slightly on its hinges to close right. And at the end of the walkthrough, she had said, "And then you'll meet Wendell. Wendell stays in the small trailer at the back of the property." She had pointed past the barn at a strip of mowed path that led through the field to a small Airstream-style trailer set under a stand of locust trees. "Wendell has been here since my daddy bought the place in 1979. My daddy hired him on as a groundskeeper that year. He has been on this property for 35 years. He does not pay rent. He does not get a salary. He cuts the grass and he keeps the place up, and that is the arrangement. I did not change it when I inherited. He is part of the property. He came with the deed." I asked her what Wendell was like. She said, "Polite, waves, does not bother, will not come up to the house unless you ask him to. He cuts the grass on Saturdays. He keeps to himself the rest of the week." I asked her where he had come from before 1979. She paused. She said, "I never asked my daddy. My daddy never offered. They had known each other a long time, I think. I am sorry I cannot tell you more. He is just Wendell." She smiled. She handed me the keys. She drove off in her sedan. Wendell came up to the porch the second day we were there to introduce himself. He was a thin man in his 60s, maybe early 70s, hard to tell, with white hair cropped short under a faded ball cap and a face that had been outside for a lot of summers. He wore a gray work shirt with the cuffs rolled to mid-forearm and a pair of Carhartt pants. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps with his cap in his hand. He told us his name. He told us he had been on the place since 1979. He told us he kept his own hours, and that he would be cutting the grass on Saturdays in the morning if that suited us, and that he was glad to do anything else around the place we needed if we just left a note on the back porch. He had a soft accent, low and unhurried. He did not look us in the eye when he spoke, but he was not shifty about it. He was a man who had spent a long time on his own and had not had a lot of practice. When he was done, he put his cap back on, nodded once, and walked back down the path through the field to his trailer. We watched him go. He did not turn around. He cut the grass that Saturday. He was in the front yard at 8 in the morning on a small green John Deere riding mower that he had brought up from the barn. He waved at us when we came out on the porch with our coffee. We waved back. He cut the front yard, then the side yards, then the back, in a careful pattern that made the grass look like a baseball field. He took 2 hours. When he was done, he drove the mower back to the barn, lifted his cap at us a second time as he passed the porch, and walked the path back to his trailer. The next Saturday was the same. The Saturday after that was the same. The fourth Saturday was the same. For the entire month of May, we saw Wendell on Saturday mornings and not on any other day. The trailer at the back of the property had its lights on at night sometimes, faint yellow squares through the locust trees. We did not see Wendell come or go from it. We did not hear a vehicle. He must have walked into town when he needed groceries, the way some older men in those mountains still did. He did not bother us. We did not bother him. The arrangement was working exactly the way Linda had said it would. The first night my husband woke up was the second week of June. He sat up in bed at maybe 4 in the morning and he turned to me and he said, "Do you hear that?" I had not been awake. I listened. I did not hear anything. I told him so. He said it had been a sound like somebody was raking gravel, very softly, somewhere outside. We listened for a few more minutes. We did not hear it. He lay back down. He did not sleep well the rest of the night. He woke up at almost the same time the next night. He did not wake me. He told me about it in the morning. He said the sound had come back. He said it had still sounded like raking gravel, but slower now, and that it had gone on for maybe 20 minutes, and that it had stopped. He had not gotten up to look. He had just lain in bed and listened. The third night he woke up, he got up. He walked to the bedroom window. The window faced the front yard. There was a half moon up. He could see the front yard clearly enough that he could pick out the shape of the porch railing and the gravel of the drive. He stood at the window for maybe 30 seconds. He came back to bed. He woke me up. He said, "I want you to come look at something." I got up. I went to the window. I looked out. There was a man in the front yard. He was walking a small push-reel mower very slowly across the lawn, in even rows, in the dark, with no flashlight. He was wearing what looked from a distance like flannel pajama pants and a white t-shirt. He was not wearing a hat. The man was Wendell. The white hair was Wendell's. The slight stoop was Wendell's. The push-reel mower was the kind I had seen leaning against the inside wall of the barn the first day we had been on the property. An old hand mower, the kind with the cylindrical blades that turn as the wheels turn, the kind that does not need an engine, the kind a man can walk across a yard without making a real sound. The grass had been cut on Saturday. Wendell was mowing it again, by hand, in the dark, in his pajamas, in perfectly even rows. We stood at the window and watched him. He was making rows that ran the long way of the front yard, parallel to the gravel road, and he was making each row pressed up against the previous row, and he was not missing a strip. He was working in absolute silence, except for the soft whisk of the reel turning. He was not hurrying. He was not pacing. He was walking the mower at the steady pace of a man who has been doing a thing for a very long time. We watched him for what was probably 10 minutes. He did not turn his head toward the house. He did not look up. He walked the mower across the front yard in even rows in the half moonlight, the way a man walks a mower across a yard in the daylight when he is half thinking, and the mowing is something his body knows how to do without him. He finished the last row at 4:45 by the bedside clock. He turned the mower around. He pushed it slowly down the gravel drive and around the side of the house and along the path through the field to his trailer. He went into the trailer. The light in the trailer did not come on. We did not see him again that night. We did not say anything to him the next morning. We did not say anything to him on the Saturday following. He cut the grass on the riding mower, the way he always did. He waved at us when we came out on the porch with our coffee. He looked exactly the way he had looked the previous Saturday. He nodded. He worked. He drove the mower back to the barn. He walked the path to his trailer. My husband woke up at 4 o'clock the next Tuesday. He went to the window. Wendell was in the front yard with the push-reel mower. He was walking the rows. My husband watched for a few minutes. He came back to bed. We lay in the dark and we did not speak. It happened every Tuesday for the rest of the month of June, then every Tuesday and every Thursday in July, then 3 nights a week in August, always at 4 in the morning, always the push-reel mower, always perfectly even rows, always for 30 to 45 minutes, always pajamas, never a flashlight, never a glance at the house, never a sign during the day that he knew, that he remembered, that he understood that we knew. He cut the grass on Saturday on the riding mower in the daylight and he waved at us and he was Wendell. And he cut the grass at 4 in the morning in his pajamas with the push mower and he was Wendell, and the two Wendells did not know about each other. I called Linda Bentley near the end of July. I did not tell her about the night mowing. I asked her, in a careful voice, whether Wendell had ever had any health issues, anything we should know about, any pattern of behavior that the previous renters had noticed. She was quiet for a second on the phone. She said, "Honey, Wendell is just Wendell. He has been Wendell since before I was old enough to ask my daddy about him. I have never known him to do anything that bothered anybody." She paused. She said, "Why do you ask?" I told her I had just wanted to make sure I was understanding the arrangement correctly. She said, "He is fine. He is part of the place. The previous people had him for 2 years and they liked him. The people before that had him for 9. He never bothered anyone." I said, "Okay." I thanked her. I hung up. The previous people had had him for 2 years. The people before that had had him for 9. Linda's father had had him from 1979 to 2003. He had been on the property in some form for 35 years. The push-reel mower in the barn was older than that. The push-reel mower had been on the property when Linda's father bought it. I had seen it propped against the wall of the barn the first week we had moved in. There had been a film of dust on it. The dust on it now, in the second week of August, was undisturbed, in a way that a tool did not become undisturbed if a man was using it 3 nights a week. I went out to the barn one afternoon. I looked at the push-reel mower. The dust on the handle was even. The dust on the wheels was even. The blades were rust-edged and dry. The mower had not been moved out of the barn in months, maybe years. We did not finish out the lease. I told Linda we had to go back to Charlotte for a family reason. She was disappointed, but she was kind about it. We loaded up the rental truck on a Tuesday morning in the middle of August. Wendell was in his trailer at the back of the property. We did not see him during the loading. We did not say goodbye. We drove down the gravel road. We drove out of Smith County. We did not go back. I have asked, over the years, whether Linda Bentley has rented the farmhouse to anybody else. I called her once, the spring after, on some pretense. She said the house was empty. She said she was not renting it that year. She said she might not rent it again. She said Wendell was still on the place. She said he still cut the grass on Saturdays. I did not ask her whether anyone had told her about the 4 o'clock mowing. I did not ask her whether she had ever stayed at the farmhouse herself. I do not know the answer to either of those questions, and I have decided that I will not, because I am almost 48 years old and I have been carrying this for 10 years already and I do not need any more of it. I will tell you that I have not pushed a real mower since, even though my husband and I have a small lawn now, and I do not own one, and I will not buy one, and there is no good reason for that, and there is also a reason I cannot explain. The first summer I lived in that little clapboard house on the edge of Whitesburg, Kentucky, I was 38 years old and trying to remember how to be alone. My wife had left me in March. By June, I had signed a lease on a place I'd never seen in person, sight unseen except for 3 blurry photographs the landlord had emailed me. And I had driven down from Cincinnati with everything I still owned crammed into the bed of a Ford Ranger and a cooler full of beer-riding shotgun. The house sat at the end of a gravel cut just past where the pavement gave out. 2 bedrooms, a sagging porch, and a backyard that ran maybe 40 feet before it met a chain-link fence, and, on the other side of that fence, the backyard of another house, almost identical to mine. The mountains rose up behind both houses like something hunched and watching. And on my first night there, I sat on the porch with a beer warming in my hand, and I thought, this is where I will learn to be quiet again. I did not yet know what quiet meant in those hollers. For the first week or so, I didn't pay much attention to the house behind mine. I saw a woman come out once to hang a sheet on a clothesline, and I saw a man in a Carhartt jacket get into a primer gray pickup one morning before light, and that was about it. The house had curtains drawn over every window, heavy ones, the kind that don't let any shape through, and there was a satellite dish on the roof that looked like it hadn't worked in 15 years. The yard itself was strange in a way I couldn't name at first. The grass was cut, but not recently. There was a swing set in the middle of it, the metal kind they used to make in the 70s, with 2 swings and a little slide, and the paint on it had gone to rust in long weeping streaks. But the seats of the swings were clean, worn smooth, like something used them. It was on a Thursday, I think, the 2nd week of June, that I saw the children for the first time. I had been out back trying to figure out where the property line ran, because the landlord had mentioned something about a shed I was welcome to use, and I was standing there with a cold can of Budweiser in my hand when the sun dropped behind the ridge. It happens fast in those mountains. You can be standing in full daylight, and then the shadow of the ridge comes across the yard like a hand pulled across a table, and everything goes blue and soft, and the air drops about 10 degrees. I was watching that happen, watching the light go, when I heard the back door of the house behind mine open. I heard it open before I saw anything, because that door had a particular sound, a kind of soft suction and then a wooden clap, and I would come to know that sound the way you know the sound of your own footstep on your own stair. 3 children came out. The oldest looked about 7, a boy in a striped shirt. The middle one was a girl, maybe 5, in a dress that hung past her knees. The youngest was a boy too, 3 at the most, and he walked the way 3-year-olds walk, with that side-to-side wobble, holding the older boy's hand. They went straight to the swing set. They didn't run. They didn't whoop or call to each other. They just walked across the yard in the failing light, and the older boy lifted the youngest into one of the swings and started pushing him, slow and steady, while the girl sat on the slide and looked out at the mountains. They played for about 45 minutes. Then the back door opened again, and they walked back to the house, and the door shut behind them, and that was that. I thought it was sweet. I really did. I thought, those are some well-behaved kids, and I went back inside and made myself a sandwich and didn't think anything more of it that night. But the next evening, at exactly the same time, the door opened again, and the same 3 children came out, and they did the same thing. The boy pushed the smallest one on the swing. The girl sat on the slide. They didn't laugh. They didn't argue. After 45 minutes, almost to the minute, the door opened and they went back inside. And the night after that, the same. And the night after that, the same. I started to notice that I never saw the children in the morning. I worked from home that summer, doing freelance bookkeeping for a couple of small businesses up north, and I was at my kitchen window all hours of the day, and the children were never out at noon, never at 3, never at any of the times when kids in those mountains run wild in the heat. I would see the woman occasionally, hanging laundry. I would see the man come and go in the pickup. I never saw the children except at dusk, and when they came out alone. The mother never came with them. The father never came with them. 3 small children, the oldest no more than 7, on a swing set 50 feet from the woods, with no one watching them, every single evening, for exactly the length of time it took the dusk to deepen into dark. It was probably 3 weeks in when I started to feel something off about it. It was nothing I could have put into words. It was the kind of wrongness you feel before you know you're feeling it, the way a room feels when someone has just left it angry. I would sit on my back porch with a beer and watch them through the chain link fence, and I would feel my arms get cold even when the air was warm. The boy pushed the swing. The girl sat on the slide. The smallest one rode and never once said "we," never once kicked his feet the way little ones do. He just sat there with his hands on the chains and let himself be pushed. And the older boy pushed him with a kind of patience that I have never seen in a child. The patience of someone doing a job. The patience of someone who has been pushing that swing for a very long time. I went into town that Saturday. There's a small grocery on the main road in Whitesburg, the kind of place that still has a bell on the door and a woman behind the counter who knows whose check is good and whose isn't. Her name was Donna. She was maybe 60, with hair dyed the color of a penny, and she had taken to me a little because I was new and lonely, and I bought my coffee from her every morning. I asked her, just casual, while I was paying for a loaf of bread, about the family in the house behind mine. I described it. The pickup, the satellite dish, the woman with the laundry. Donna was ringing up my bread, and when I described the house, she stopped. She stopped with her hand on the bread and she looked up at me, and she gave me a look I have thought about many times since. It was not a frightened look. It was something worse than frightened. It was the look of somebody who has been waiting a long time for a particular question and is sorry it's finally being asked. She said, "The Hadleys." She said it the way you'd say the name of a town that had burned down. She said they moved into that house in 1996. She said the man's name was Roy and the woman's name was Linny, and they had 3 children, and the children had been 3, 5, and 7 the whole time. I laughed because I thought she was making a joke, the kind of small-town joke an old woman makes to a flatlander who's been asking too many questions. But Donna didn't laugh. She rang up my bread. She put it in a paper sack. And then she said, real quiet, real careful, she said, "Honey, don't watch them." She said, "When they come out in the evening, you go in your house, and you turn on your television and you don't look out that window." She said, "Roy and Linny, they don't come out at dusk. They don't come out then for a reason," she said. "You just leave it alone." I drove home with the bread on the seat next to me and my hands cold on the wheel. I tried to do what she said. I really did. That evening I made myself a plate of supper and I turned on the television and I sat in the front room with the volume up, and I did not look out the back window, but I could hear it. I could hear the back door of the house behind mine open at the moment the ridge took the sun. I could hear the soft suction and the wooden clap, and I sat there in my front room with a baseball game on, and I felt the children walk out into that yard. I felt them. I cannot explain it any better than that. And after about 20 minutes, I could not stand it anymore. I got up and I walked to the kitchen and I looked out the window over the sink. The 3 of them were out there. The boy was pushing the swing. The girl was on the slide. But the smallest one, the 3-year-old in the swing, was looking at my window. He was looking right at me. And when he saw me looking back, he smiled. It was not the smile of a 3-year-old. I want you to understand that. It was a smile that went too wide, and it stayed too long, and it had a kind of recognition in it, a kind of hello again in it. And I stepped back from the window so fast I knocked a glass off the counter, and it broke on the linoleum. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my front room with all the lights on, and I drank 3 beers, and I listened to the house behind mine. Around 2 in the morning, I heard their back door open. I heard it. I am as sure of that sound as I am of my own name. It opened, and it stayed open, for what must have been 2 or 3 minutes, and then it shut. Nobody came out. Nobody went in. The door just opened and stayed open and shut. In the morning, I called the landlord and I told him I needed out of the lease. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He said, "I'll send somebody for the key." And that was the only thing he said. I had the truck packed by noon. I drove past the grocery on my way out of town, and Donna was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the door, and when she saw my truck, she stopped sweeping, and she lifted one hand in a kind of wave that wasn't really a wave, more like an acknowledgement, more like a goodbye to somebody who had made the right choice. I lifted my hand back. I drove out of Whitesburg, and I have never been back. I asked around. Later, in the way you do when something has its hooks in you, I made some calls. I found a man who used to deliver propane in that holler in the early 90s. And over the phone, he told me that the Hadleys had lost 3 children in 1995. A house fire. Roy was at work. Linny had run out for groceries and left them sleeping. The oldest was 7, the middle was 5, the youngest was 3. He told me they rebuilt the house on the same foundation the next year, and Linny and Roy moved back in, and people in town said it was a strange thing for them to do. But grief makes people strange, and after a while folks stopped talking about it. He told me Roy died in 2011. He told me Linny was still in that house, the last he'd heard, an old woman now, alone. And I asked him, because I had to. I asked him about the children in the yard at dusk, and there was a long quiet on the line. And then he said, "Son, I told you what I know. I don't go down that road after sundown. I haven't in 20 years. I sometimes wonder, when I can't sleep, whether Linny watches them from her kitchen window. Whether she stands there in the blue light at the end of the day and sees her babies come out of the back door of a house that burned down 30 years ago and play their 45 minutes in the yard and walk back inside to a place she can't follow them to. I wonder if it comforts her. I wonder if it's the only thing that's kept her in that house all these years. The chance to see them, even like that, even wrong, even smiling the way that smallest one smiled at me. I hope it does. I hope something does. Because I have thought about that smile every night for 4 years now, and I have not yet found the bottom of what was in it. We bought the farm outside Floyd, Virginia. In the summer, my husband retired from the post office, which was the summer of his 63rd year and my 60th. And we paid for it in cash with the money we had saved for 38 years, living in a little brick house in Roanoke that we did not love, but had paid off early. The farm was 41 acres of mostly hillside, with a gray 2-story farmhouse that needed work, a sagging tobacco barn we never used, and a stretch of 2-lane road that ran past the front porch with maybe 4 cars on it a day. We had wanted quiet, and we got it. The first year we were there, I sometimes stood on the porch in the morning with my coffee and I could hear my own pulse in my ears. That's how quiet it was. My husband Earl took to it the way some men take to a religion. He bought a tractor he didn't need, and a pair of overalls he wore even to the grocery store, and he was happier than I had seen him, since our daughter was small. I was happy too, in a slower way. I had my garden, I had the porch, I had Earl. I thought we had earned the rest of our lives. Our only neighbor on that stretch of road was a man named Klein. His house sat about a quarter-mile down from ours, a low brick ranch with a carport on one side and a satellite dish bolted to a pole in the yard, and he lived in it alone. He was maybe 70, a thin man with the kind of weathered face you see in those mountains, the skin gone to leather around the eyes from squinting into too many summers. He had a green pickup, a Ford, late 80s I'd guess, that he drove into Floyd twice a week, Tuesday and Friday, regular as a bus. We met him our first week there. Earl walked down with a tin of cookies I'd made, and Klein came out into his yard and shook Earl's hand and accepted the cookies and said about 4 words to him, all of them polite, none of them warm, and that was the extent of our neighborliness for the next year and a half. He was not unfriendly. He just kept to himself in the way that mountain men keep to themselves, which is a complete way, a way that does not leave any door open for further conversation. Earl said, after that first visit, that Klein was the kind of man who probably hadn't had a real conversation with another human being in 10 years and didn't miss it. I thought that was a sad thing to say. I thought about Klein alone in that brick house, and I felt sorry for him in a vague, unfocused way, the way you feel sorry for somebody you don't really know. The summer of our second year there was when I started hearing the truck. It was late June, I remember, because the fireflies were thick over the field across the road, and I had taken to sleeping with the bedroom window cracked. Because Earl liked the room cold, and I liked it warm, and the open window was our compromise. I woke up at about 2 in the morning to the sound of an engine. Not close, not loud, just the steady rumble of a truck idling somewhere down the road. I lay there for a minute with my eyes open in the dark, trying to place it, and then I realized it was Klein's truck. I knew the sound of it from him driving past our house twice a week. It had a rough idle, the way old trucks do, a kind of cough every few seconds in the rhythm of it. I got out of bed, and I went to the window. Our bedroom looks down the road toward Klein's place, and from our window I could see his driveway clear as anything in the moonlight. The truck was sitting there in the drive, just sitting. The headlights were not on, the cab was dark, but the engine was running. I could hear it, and I could see the little shimmer of exhaust coming up from the back of it in the moonlight, that wavy heat that comes off a running engine in cold air. I stood there at the window for maybe 5 minutes, watching. Nobody got in the truck, nobody got out of it. The driver's door never opened. The house was dark. Every window in Klein's house was dark. The truck just sat there and idled, and after about 30 or 40 minutes, it shut off, just stopped. The way a truck stops when somebody turns the key. And then the night was quiet again, and after a while I went back to bed, and in the morning I told Earl about it over coffee. He said Klein was probably letting it warm up for some reason, or charging the battery, or any one of a dozen things old men do with old trucks for reasons that make sense only to them. I said, at 2 in the morning. Earl said, "The man lives alone, Marie. He can run his truck whenever he wants." And that was the end of it for that morning. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that, and then it started happening every night. 2 o'clock in the morning, give or take 10 minutes, the truck would start. It would idle for 30 or 40 minutes, and then it would shut off. The headlights never came on. Nobody ever got into the cab and nobody ever got out of it. I started staying up to watch. I would lie in bed pretending to sleep, and around 1:45, I'd ease out of the covers and go to the window, and I'd stand there in my nightgown, in the dark, and wait. And every night, sometime between 2 and 2:15, the engine would turn over and that rough idle would settle in, and I would stand there at the window and watch the empty truck in the empty driveway in front of the dark house. I never once saw anybody walk to it. I never once saw the dome light come on. I never once saw a shadow move in the cab. I tried to be reasonable about it. I told myself there had to be an explanation. I told myself maybe he had one of those remote starters, the kind that lets you start your truck from inside the house, and he was using it for some reason, to keep the battery up, or to run the heater for an animal he was keeping in there, or any one of 100 things. I told myself that, but there is a thing that happens when you stand at a window in the middle of the night and watch something that does not make sense, night after night, and the explanations you make for yourself start to wear thin. They start to feel like things you are saying out loud to keep yourself company. By the 3rd week of it, I had stopped trying to explain it, and I was just watching. I was watching and I was listening, and I was getting a feeling that I did not like at all. It was Earl who finally said we should walk down and ask. He said it had gone on long enough, that maybe Klein had a medical thing going on, that maybe he was getting up in the night confused, that we ought to be neighborly about it and just ask. I think Earl had started to hear it too by then, even though he slept with earplugs in, because he had been quieter at breakfast for a week or so. And once I caught him standing at the kitchen window at 6 in the morning looking down the road toward Klein's place with a strange expression on his face. So one evening in late July, just before dark, we walked down the road together. It was maybe a 1/4 mile. The cicadas were going hard in the trees on either side of us, and the air smelled like cut hay from the field across the way. Klein's truck was in the driveway when we got there, parked exactly where it always was. And as we walked up, I had the strangest urge to put my hand on the hood. I don't know why. I just wanted to feel whether it was warm. I didn't do it. Earl knocked on the front door. Klein answered after a long minute. He was in a white t-shirt and jeans, and he was barefoot, and he looked at us through the screen door without opening it and said, "Evening." Earl said his piece. He said we'd been hearing the truck idle at night, and we just wanted to make sure everything was all right, and was there anything we could help with. And Klein stood there behind the screen and listened to the whole thing without his face moving. When Earl was done, Klein said, "My truck don't run." He said it just like that. "My truck don't run." Earl said, "Beg pardon." Klein said, "The truck, it ain't run in 8 months. Won't start. I've been meaning to have it towed." He said all of this in a flat voice, like he was reciting something. And then he looked past us, out at the truck in his driveway, and I watched his face while he looked at it, and I saw something move across it that I have not been able to forget. It was not surprise. It was not confusion. It was the look of a man confirming something he already knew. The look of a man who has been listening to that truck idle at 2 in the morning for 8 months and has stopped asking himself why. Earl said, "Well, we've been hearing an engine." Klein said, "I know you have." And then he said, "You all have a good evening." And he closed the inner door, and we heard the lock turn, and Earl and I stood there on his concrete stoop in the last of the light and looked at each other. We walked home without saying much. Earl tried to make a joke about it halfway back, something about how Klein was probably running a moonshine operation out of the truck and didn't want to admit it. But the joke fell flat between us, and he didn't try another. When we got back to our porch, Earl went and got a flashlight out of the kitchen drawer and walked back down the road by himself. I stood on our porch and watched him go. He was gone maybe 20 minutes. When he came back, he came up the porch steps slow, and he sat down in the rocker next to mine, and he set the flashlight on the floor between his feet, and he said, "The hood is cold. The hood is cold, Marie, and there is 2 inches of dust on it, and there is a wasp nest the size of my fist in the wheel well, and that truck has not been started in a long time." He said, "I lifted the hood. The battery is gone. There's no battery in it." He said it with a flatness in his voice that I had not heard from him in all our years of marriage. We heard it again that night, 2 o'clock, the rough idle, the cough every few seconds, 35 minutes of it, and then the shutoff. We lay in bed next to each other, with our eyes open, and we did not speak. There is a thing that happens between 2 people who have been married a long time, where you don't have to say what you're thinking because the other person is thinking it too. And what we were thinking that night was that there was no battery in that truck, and the truck was idling in the driveway, and there was nothing we could do about it, and there was nothing to do about it, and we were going to have to live with it, or we were going to have to leave. We left in October. We listed the farm with a realtor in Floyd, and we took the first reasonable offer, which was less than what we'd paid for it, and we moved back to Roanoke and rented a little apartment near our daughter. I never told her why we left. I told her Earl missed the city. Earl, to his credit, never contradicted me. He died 4 years later of a heart attack in his sleep, and he was a good man, and I miss him every day. But I will tell you one thing that I never told anybody until now. The week before we moved out of that farmhouse, I drove past Klein's place one afternoon on my way home from the grocery, and Klein was standing in his yard, looking at the truck, just standing there, hands in his pockets, looking at it the way you look at a thing you have given up trying to understand. And as I drove past, he turned his head and he looked at me, and he gave me a little nod. Not a friendly nod, a nod like one soldier gives another, a nod that said, "I know what you've been hearing, and I know you're leaving, and I don't blame you, and I wish I could too, but I can't, and I won't, and that's just how it is." I read in the Floyd paper about 3 years after we moved that Klein had died in his house, of natural causes, found by a cousin who came to check on him after he missed church. The article said he was 74. It said he had lived in that brick ranch for 41 years. It did not say anything about a green Ford pickup in the driveway. But I have wondered, in the years since, whether the new people who bought that house, whoever they are, ever wake up at 2 in the morning to the sound of an engine that should not be running, in a driveway that should be empty, in a county that does not have any explanation to give them. And I have wondered whether they stand at their window and watch, the way I used to watch. And I have wondered whether, after a while, they stop trying to explain it too. I rented the cottage on a back road outside Boone the summer I was 36, the summer I was supposed to finish my dissertation. And I picked the place because it was cheap, and because the listing said quiet, and because the photographs showed a window over a kitchen sink that looked out onto a green hillside, and I thought, that is a window I could write under. I had been working on the dissertation for 6 years by then. It was on the rhetoric of the rural South, which is a thing I had grown up around in eastern Tennessee and walked away from at 18, and was now, at 36, trying to walk back into through the side door of an English department in Connecticut. My advisor had told me in March that if I didn't have a complete draft by Labor Day, she was going to have to recommend I take a leave, which is the academic way of saying she was going to recommend I be quietly removed from the program, and I had taken what was left of my savings and rented the cottage from May to September, and told myself that this was the summer I would either finish the thing or stop pretending I ever would. The cottage sat on a half-acre of grass at the bottom of a slope, and the slope rose up to a much larger property, maybe 4 or 5 acres, with an old stone farmhouse on the high ground. The farmhouse was beautiful, in the way old mountain houses are beautiful, low and heavy, built out of field stones that some great-grandfather had pulled out of the ground with a mule, with a tin roof that had gone the color of a thunderhead, and a wraparound porch with a swing on the south end. The house belonged to a woman named Mrs. Hatcher. The realtor had told me about her before I signed the lease. She said, "The lady next door is in her 80s. She keeps to herself. She's a perfect neighbor. You'll never hear a peep out of her." And that was true. In all the months I lived there, I do not think Mrs. Hatcher and I spoke more than 4 sentences to each other. And all of those sentences were exchanged across the fence in the first week, when she had come down to her side of it to look at me and welcome me and tell me her name, and to ask my name, and to say that if I ever needed anything, I should come up to the house and knock. She was a small woman, maybe 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in a knot and a face that had been pretty once and had settled into something kinder. She wore a faded blue house dress. She had hands that had done work. I liked her immediately, in the uncomplicated way you like an old woman who reminds you a little of your grandmother, and I thought, good, I have a good neighbor, I can write here. I started seeing her in the garden the second morning I was there. The garden was on the downhill side of her property, between her house and my cottage, and from my kitchen window I had a clear view of it across maybe 60 yards of grass. It was a proper garden, the old-fashioned kind, with the rows running north to south and a chicken wire fence around it to keep the deer out and a little wooden gate with a latch. She came out every morning at 7 o'clock. I mean this. I am not exaggerating for effect. I would be at my kitchen table with my coffee and my laptop, and I would hear the screen door of her house slap shut, and I would look up, and there she would come down the slope with her wide straw hat on her head and her gardening gloves on her hands, and a galvanized watering can in one hand and a little wooden trug in the other. She would let herself in through the wooden gate. She would close it behind her, and she would work in that garden until 10 o'clock. She weeded, she watered, she knelt in the dirt, and she pinched things off, and she put them in the trug. She moved up and down the rows the way a person moves through a familiar room in the dark, without looking, by feel. At 10, she would gather her things, and she would let herself out through the gate, and she would walk up the slope to her house, and the screen door would slap shut behind her, and that would be the end of her gardening for the day. It was the most peaceful sight you have ever seen. I used to stop writing sometimes and just watch her for a few minutes, the way you watch a fire in a fireplace, because there was a kind of rest in it. I noticed it first in early August, and I want to say this carefully, because the noticing is the whole thing. I had been there about 11 weeks by then, and I had been watching that garden almost every morning for 11 weeks. And one Tuesday morning in the first week of August, I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing out my coffee cup, and I looked up at the garden and I thought, where are the tomatoes? That was the thought. Just like that. Where are the tomatoes? Because there were tomato plants. There were maybe 20 of them, in 2 long, tidy rows, staked up with bamboo and tied with strips of old pantyhose the way my grandmother used to tie hers. And they were green, and they were healthy, and they were the right size for tomato plants in early August in the mountains of North Carolina. But there were no tomatoes on them. Not green ones, not red ones, not little hard yellow ones starting to come in. There was no fruit on the plants at all. And once I had thought it about the tomatoes, I could not stop thinking it about the rest of the garden. There were bean vines climbing up their poles. There were no beans on the vines. There were squash plants spreading their big leaves across the dirt. There were no squashes under the leaves. There were pepper plants in a tidy row. There were no peppers. There was a row of corn at the back of the garden, tall and green and tasseling. And I stood at my kitchen window for a long time looking at that corn, and I could not see a single ear on a single stalk. I want to tell you that I dismissed it. I want to tell you that I thought, well, it's a bad year, or, well, the deer have been getting in, or, well, she's been picking everything early and I just haven't seen her do it. I did think those things. I thought all of them, in the order I just listed them. But I had been watching her for 11 weeks. I had watched her kneel in those rows every morning for 11 weeks. I had never once seen her carry anything out of that garden in the trug. The trug went in empty and it came out empty. I had never seen her bring a basket. I had never seen her walk back up to the house with her arms full of squash. I had never in 11 weeks seen a single piece of food come out of that garden. I started watching her differently after that. I felt bad about it, the way you feel bad about staring at someone with a strange birthmark, but I could not stop. I would sit at my kitchen table and pretend to work on my dissertation, and I would watch her over the top of my laptop, and I would try to see what she was actually doing in those rows. And here is what I saw. She weeded. She really did weed. She would pull up little green things and put them in the trug. She watered with the can, walking up and down the rows and tipping the spout over the base of each plant. She pinched things off the plants, the way you pinch suckers off a tomato, and she put those in the trug too. She moved with intent. She moved like a woman who had been gardening her whole life and knew exactly what she was doing. But the plants did not bear fruit. Not one of them. Not all summer. I thought about asking her about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I would rehearse the question in my head while I was supposed to be writing about the rhetorical strategies of Appalachian preachers, and I could not find a way to ask it that did not sound either condescending or unhinged. "How is your garden coming along?" was the closest I got, and even that felt wrong, because a garden either is coming along or it is not, and we both could see that hers was not, and to ask the question would have been to make her say so out loud, which felt like a cruelty I did not have the right to do to an old woman who had been nothing but kind to me. So I asked at the feed store instead. There was a feed store on the way into Boone where I bought my coffee and sometimes a sandwich, and the man behind the counter was a fellow about 60 named Dell who had grown up in the holler and knew everybody. I asked him, real casual one afternoon, did he know Mrs. Hatcher up on the Ridge Road? He said he did. He said he'd known her since he was a boy. I said, "She keeps a beautiful garden," and Dell looked at me for a moment. The way a man looks at you when you've said something he was hoping you wouldn't say, and then he looked down at the counter, and he wiped at it with a rag that didn't need wiping. He said, "She's kept that garden 50-some years." He said, "Her husband Earl built the fence around it the year they got married." He said, "Earl died in 1971, and their boy Wendell died in 1974, in a car accident on the road coming up from Lenoir. He was 19 years old." He said, "After Wendell died, Mrs. Hatcher kept on with the garden, and she kept on with it through the 70s and through the 80s and through the 90s, and she keeps on with it now." And I said, "The garden doesn't grow anything." And Dell was quiet for a long moment, still wiping at the counter, and he said, "No, ma'am, it hasn't grown a thing in a long time." He said, "She doesn't plant seeds." He said, "She goes down to the nursery in March and she buys starts, tomato starts and pepper starts and squash starts, and she puts them in the ground and she tends them, and they grow up green and they grow up healthy and they don't bear." He said, "My wife asked her about it once, maybe 15 years ago." He said, "My wife said, 'Mrs. Hatcher, what do you do with all that you grow up there?' And Mrs. Hatcher said, 'Oh, I don't grow anything, honey. I just keep the garden.'" And Dell looked up at me and he said, "That's all she said about it, and nobody has asked her since." I went home that afternoon and I sat on the little porch of my cottage and I looked up at her garden in the late afternoon light. The plants were green, the rows were tidy, the chicken wire was straight. Somewhere in that house up on the ridge, an old woman was sitting in a chair, or standing at a stove, or looking out a window, and tomorrow morning at 7 she would come back down with her hat and her gloves and her watering can and her empty trug, and she would tend the rows, and the rows would not bear, and that was the bargain she had made with something, or that something had made with her, a long time ago. I thought about it almost every day for the rest of that summer. I would sit at my kitchen table, and I would watch her in the garden, and I would try to imagine what it had been like in 1974 when the deputy came up the gravel drive to tell her about her son, and I would try to imagine her the next morning, the morning after that, going out to the garden because there was nowhere else to go, and nothing else to do, and putting her hands in the dirt because the dirt was the only thing she had left that was still alive and still hers. And I would think about her doing that the next day, and the next, for 50 years. and I would think about the plants, year after year, refusing to give her anything back. And I do not know if it was that she had stopped expecting them to, or that they had stopped knowing how, or whether the ground itself had simply given up around her, the way ground sometimes does in those old places, where too much grief has soaked into it. I don't know. I never asked her. I finished my dissertation in the second week of September, and I packed up the cottage, and I drove back to Connecticut, and I never saw her again. I heard from the realtor, 2 years later, in a Christmas card she sent to all her old tenants, that Mrs. Hatcher had passed in October at the age of 86. The card said she had gone peacefully, in her sleep. I sat at my kitchen table in Connecticut and I read that, and I put the card down, and I thought about that garden up on the ridge in North Carolina, and I wondered who was tending it now. I wondered if anybody was. I wondered if the plants were still standing in their tidy rows, green and healthy and bearing nothing, waiting for the small woman in the straw hat who was not coming back down the slope at 7 in the morning. Not tomorrow, not ever, and I hope, more than I can tell you, that somebody pulled them up. I hope somebody went in there with a spade and turned that ground over and let it rest. Because there are some gardens, I think, that aren't gardens at all. There are some patches of dirt that a person tends not because they expect anything to grow, but because the tending is the only thing keeping something else from coming up out of the ground. And I do not know what was under Mrs. Hatcher's garden. I do not want to know. But I think about it, sometimes, late at night, and I hope to God somebody had the sense to leave it alone. I rented the bungalow off County Road, 1106, outside Brevard the summer I turned 41. The summer after the layoff, and I picked the place because it was $300 a week, and because the listing said wooded and private, and because I was tired of being a person anybody could find. I had been a graphic designer at a marketing firm in Charlotte for 14 years, and in March they had let go of half the design department in a single afternoon, and I had spent April and May sitting in my apartment refreshing my email and watching my severance drain into rent on a place I no longer needed to live in, to be near a job I no longer had. By the first week of June, I had decided I needed to be somewhere I could think. The bungalow was on a property of about 6 acres at the end of a gravel drive, with a screened-in porch and a wood stove and a kitchen with linoleum the color of old butter, and when I pulled up to it that first afternoon and got out of my car and listened, there was no sound in any direction except the trees. I thought, this is what I needed. I thought, I will be all right here. The owner, a woman named Marlene who lived in Asheville and managed the rental over the phone, had walked me through the place the day I picked up the keys at her office. She had pointed out the breaker box, the well pump, the propane shutoff, and on the kitchen counter, next to a wicker basket of takeout menus from restaurants that had probably closed years ago, there was an old beige push-button telephone, the kind with the curly cord and the little plastic pull tab in the dial that you could write the phone number on. The pull tab was blank. Marlene had tapped the phone with one fingernail and said, "The line's free with the cabin. The previous owner kept it. I never bothered to have it disconnected." She said, "You can use it if you need to. Long distance is blocked, but it works fine for local." I had said something polite about how nobody used landlines anymore, and she had laughed, and that was the last thing either of us said about it. I did not give the number to anyone. I did not know what the number was. I had my cell phone, and the cell signal at the bungalow was poor but workable if I stood near the kitchen window, and the few people who needed to reach me, my sister in Raleigh and my landlord in Charlotte and a recruiter or two, had my cell. The landline sat on the counter and I did not think about it for the first 6 hours I was in the house. I unloaded my car. I made up the bed. I put a frozen pizza in the oven. I opened a beer and stood at the screen door of the porch and watched the light go green and gold through the trees. And I felt, for the first time in 3 months, something that was not quite peace, but was at least the absence of dread. The phone rang at 8 o'clock. I had just sat down at the little kitchen table with my pizza on a paper plate, and the phone rang, and I jumped so hard I knocked my beer over. It was loud. Old phones are loud in a way we have all forgotten. It was that mechanical bell sound, the real one, the one that comes from a little hammer hitting a little brass dome inside the housing of the phone, and in a quiet house in the middle of the woods at 8 o'clock on a June evening, it sounded like an alarm. I picked up. I said hello. There was nobody on the line. There was not even a dial tone, exactly. There was a kind of open quiet, the way an open line sounds, that little hush of distance, and underneath it I could hear, or thought I could hear, a faint sound that might have been wind, or might have been somebody breathing very far away. I said hello again. Nothing answered. I hung up. I figured it was a wrong number, or a robocall that had decided not to commit, or some leftover quirk of an old line, and I cleaned up the beer and ate my pizza and forgot about it. The phone rang at 8 the next night. I picked up. Same thing. The open quiet. The faint sound underneath that might or might not have been there. I said hello 3 times. Nobody answered. I hung up. The phone rang at 8 the night after that, and the night after that, and the night after that. By the end of the first week, I had stopped saying hello. I would just pick up and listen, and put the receiver back down. By the end of the second week, I had stopped picking up at all. I would be at the kitchen table with my laptop, working on a freelance logo I had picked up to keep my hand in. And at 8 o'clock, the phone would ring, and I would sit there and let it ring. It rang 10 times, always 10 times. Then it stopped. I started timing it on my watch, the second week, because I am the kind of person who responds to inexplicable things by trying to make them measurable, and the rings were spaced about 4 seconds apart, and 10 of them took about 38 seconds. And then the line went quiet, and the bungalow was still again, and I would sit at the table with my heart going a little faster than I wanted to admit, and try to go back to my logo. I want to tell you that the calls didn't bother me. I want to tell you I was rational about them. But there is something about a phone ringing in an empty house at the same time every single night that gets under your skin in a way that is hard to describe to somebody who has not lived through it. It is the regularity of the thing. It is the patience. By the 10th or 11th night, I was finding myself watching the clock starting around 7:40. I was finding my shoulders coming up around my ears as the minute hand crept toward the 12. I was finding myself unable to concentrate on anything between 7:30 and 8:30, which meant I was losing an hour of my evening every day, which meant I was getting less work done, which meant I was getting less sleep, which meant by the end of the second week I was tired and rattled and not quite myself, and that was when I decided to walk over and see Henry. Henry was the only neighbor I had. His house sat about 100 yards through the trees, on the other side of a dry creek bed, and you could just see the corner of his porch from the bungalow's driveway, if the leaves were still. I had met him my third day there, when he had walked over with a paper sack of tomatoes from his garden and introduced himself. He was a thin old man in a flannel shirt, even in June, with gray hair cut close and a face that had seen a lot of weather, and he had not said much that first visit, just hello, welcome, here are some tomatoes. My name is Henry. Holler if you need anything. He had not asked me anything about myself. I had appreciated that. I had not been sure, that day, whether he was unfriendly or just the kind of mountain person who does not waste words. But by the end of the second week, when I needed somebody to talk to about the phone, he was the only person I knew within 20 miles. And so I walked over. It was about 4 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Henry was on his porch, in a green metal chair, drinking a glass of something that might have been iced tea, and might not have been. He watched me come up his drive without getting up. I stood at the bottom of his porch steps, and I said, "Henry, I'm sorry to bother you. I have a strange question." He said, "All right." I said, "Has the phone at the bungalow always rung at 8 o'clock at night?" He didn't answer right away. He took a long drink from his glass. He set the glass down on the little table next to his chair. He looked out at the trees for what must have been 10 or 15 seconds. And then he looked at me, and his face had changed in a way I cannot quite describe. Gone still in a way that faces go still when somebody has been waiting a long time for a particular question. He said, "You've been picking up." I said, "I picked up the first few nights. I haven't been lately." He said, "Good." He said, "Don't pick up that phone again." I sat down on his porch step without being invited to, because my legs had gone a little funny. I said, "Henry, what is it?" He took another drink from his glass, and he set it down, and he told me a woman named Coralie had lived in the bungalow from 1968 until 2003. He told me she had moved there as a young bride with her husband, a man named Boyd, and they had lived there together for 24 years until Boyd died of a heart attack in the kitchen of the bungalow in the spring of 1992. Henry said he had been the one to find him, because Coralie had run across the creek bed to get him, and he had walked back with her, and Boyd had been on the linoleum floor next to the refrigerator, and he had been gone an hour at least. Henry said Coralie had lived alone in the bungalow for 11 more years after that, until her own health gave out, and her daughter moved her to a nursing home in Hendersonville, where she died in 2005. He said Boyd worked second shift at a plant down in Pisgah Forest from 1970 till he retired in 1989. He said Boyd called her every night at 8 on his break, every night for 19 years. He said, even after he retired, even when he was home with her, when he went out for groceries or down to the hardware store or anywhere, he would find a payphone and he would call her at 8 just to say hello, just to say I love you, just because that was what they did. He said, Coralie told me once, at a church supper, that in 30-some years of marriage she did not remember Boyd ever missing the 8 o'clock call. Not once. Not even the night his mother died. Not even the night of the ice storm in 1986. He always called. Henry took another drink. He looked at me. He said, the phone in that bungalow started ringing at 8 o'clock the night after Boyd died. Coralie told me that herself. She told me she picked it up the first night and there was nobody there. And she picked it up the second night and there was nobody there. And by the third night, she had figured out what it was. And she said she picked up that phone every night at 8, from 1992 until the day her daughter took her out of that house, in 2003. And she did not say a word into it, and she did not need to. She just held the receiver to her ear for the length of the call, and she listened to the open line, and she put it back down. He said, she told me she could feel him on the other end. She said it was the only thing that kept her in that house after he was gone. She said she didn't care if it wasn't really him. She said it was close enough. Henry looked at me a long time after he said that. He said, the phone has rung every night at 8 since 1992. Marlene knows. Everybody on this road knows. Nobody picks it up anymore. The renters who pick it up the first few nights, they always stop. He said, the man who used to call her is dead, son. He has been dead a long time. He calls anyway. I walked back to the bungalow through the trees, and I did not pick up the phone that night, or the next night, or any night for the rest of the summer. It rang at 8 every evening, 10 rings, 38 seconds, then quiet. I got used to it, the way you get used to a clock chiming in another room. By August, I was barely noticing it. I finished out my lease at the end of September, and I drove back to Charlotte, and I took a job at a smaller firm, and I started over, the way you do. But there is one thing I have not told anybody until now. On my last night in the bungalow, the night before I drove home, I sat at the kitchen table at 7:58, and I watched the phone, and at 8 o'clock when it rang, I picked it up. I don't know why I did it. I had told myself for 3 months that I wouldn't, and on my last night I did. I held the receiver to my ear, and I listened to the open quiet, and underneath it I heard the faint sound that might have been wind, or might have been breathing, and I did not say hello. I just held it. I held it for the whole length of the call, until the line went dead in my hand. And in the second before it went dead, I heard, or I think I heard, I will never be sure, a man's voice, very soft, very far away, say one word. He said, Coralie, and then the line was empty, and then the line was dead, and I put the receiver back down, and I sat at the table in that quiet kitchen for a long time, and I thought about a man who had been calling his wife at 8 o'clock for 34 years, 23 of them from somewhere I could not begin to imagine. And I thought about how nobody had told him yet that she was not there to answer. And I thought about how maybe nobody ever would. And I put my head down on the table in that yellow kitchen in the woods outside Brevard. And I cried for a man I had never met, and for a woman I had never met, and for whatever it is in this world that keeps a promise long after there is anybody left to keep it to. My wife Ann and I started renting the lake house outside Bryson City the summer after I had my first heart episode, the summer I was 59, because the cardiologist had told me I needed to find a way to slow down or my second episode would be my last one. We had been married 31 years by then. Our daughters were grown and out of the house, both of them living up in Asheville with families of their own. And Ann had taken early retirement from the school system that spring. And I was supposed to be cutting back at the law office, which I was doing in the way lawyers cut back which is to say, not very much. The lake house was Anne's idea. She had found it on a vacation rental site one Sunday afternoon in February, and she had shown me the pictures over the kitchen table, and she had said, 3 weeks in July, the cardiologist said you need to slow down. This is what slowing down looks like. And I had looked at the pictures, the screened porch out over the water, the little dock, the kitchen with the blue tile, and I had said, all right. The cove was on the north arm of Fontana Lake, off a gravel road that branched off another gravel road that branched off Highway 28, and the house sat on maybe a half-acre of pine and hardwood that sloped down to the water. The dock had a green metal roof. The porch was the best feature, a long screened-in box that ran the whole back of the house and looked out over the cove, and Anne and I made a habit, that first summer, of eating every supper out there at the wicker table, watching the light go slow across the water. We rented the same house the next summer, and the summer after that, which was the summer this story is about, the summer we were 60 and 61. And by that third summer, the porch and the table and the 6:30 supper had become a thing we looked forward to all year, the small ritual that made the rest of our lives bearable. The cove was small enough that you could see the houses on the other side clear as anything, maybe 200 yards across the water. There were 3 houses over there. The one on the left was a vacation place that we never saw anybody at. The one in the middle had a family from Atlanta who came up 2 weeks in August, friendly people, who waved when they saw us on the dock. The house on the right was a year-round place. It was a low brown house with a tin roof and a wooden dock that was missing some boards, and there were 4 people who lived in it, and we had seen them off and on the previous 2 summers without ever speaking to them. There was a man in his 60s, heavyset, who wore the same gray t-shirt every time we saw him. There was a woman of about the same age, thin, gray hair pulled back, and there were 2 grown sons, both of them in their 30s, both of them tall and big through the shoulders. They had a little aluminum fishing boat that one of the sons would take out sometimes in the early morning. They kept a goat, of all things, that we could hear bleating now and then on a still day. Otherwise, they kept to themselves, and we kept to ourselves, and that was the extent of our acquaintance with them. It was the 3rd Tuesday of our 3rd summer when Anne first noticed it. We had sat down to supper at 6:30 as we always did, with a casserole she had made and a salad and a glass of white wine each, and we were maybe 5 minutes into the meal when Anne said, "Look at that." I followed her eyes across the cove. The 4 of them were standing at the edge of their water. The man, the woman, the 2 sons. They were standing in a line, about an arm's length apart, right where the grass of their yard met the water of the cove, and they were facing our porch. They were not doing anything. They were not talking to each other. They were not holding fishing poles or drinks or anything else. They were just standing there, all 4 of them, looking across the water at us. I waved. It was the natural thing to do. Anne waved too. None of them waved back. They did not move. They did not nod. They simply continued to stand there at the edge of the water and look at our porch. I said, "That's strange." Anne said, "Are they looking at us? Or are they looking at something else, like a bird or something on the roof?" I turned in my chair and I looked behind us, up at the house. There was nothing on the roof. There was no bird. When I turned back around, the 4 of them were still standing there in their line at the shore, watching us eat. I am going to tell you that I did not feel afraid that first evening. And that is true, but I felt something. I felt a kind of self-consciousness I had not felt at a dinner table since I was a young man on a first date. I found that I was eating differently. I found I was holding my fork differently. Anne and I made conversation, and we laughed at something she said about her sister, and the whole time I was aware of the 4 of them across the cove. I tried not to look. When I did look, they were always still standing there. When we finished eating, and Anne stood up to start clearing the table, I looked across one more time, and I watched all 4 of them turn around at the same time, in unison, like they had heard a whistle I could not hear, and walk back up the slope to their brown house. The screen door of the house opened and closed 4 times. The man went in first, then the woman, then the older son, then the younger. The door closed behind the younger one, and the cove was quiet again, and the light on the water was the color of a peach. Anne said, "That was the strangest thing I have ever seen." I said, "I'm sure there's an explanation." Anne said, "What could the explanation possibly be?" I did not have an answer for her. They did it again the next night. They came out of the house at 6:28 by my watch. They walked down to the edge of the water in a loose group and arranged themselves into the line, the man on the left, then the woman, then the older son, then the younger. And they stood there from 6:30 when we sat down with our supper until just past 7 when we stood up to clear the table. And then they turned around all together and they walked back up to the house. The screen door opened and closed 4 times. We did not wave that second night. It had begun to feel like waving was the wrong response, like waving was acknowledging a thing that we were better off pretending we did not see. I want to tell you what it felt like. I want you to understand. They were 200 yards away. They could not have heard our conversation. They could not have seen, in any specific way, what was on our plates. They were not menacing in their posture. They did not stare with any particular hostility. They just stood there, 4 people in a line at the edge of the water, watching the place where 2 old people sat eating their supper. And there was a quality to it, a patience and a steadiness to it, that made the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up in a way I had not felt since I was a child. It is the feeling you get when something is wrong, but you cannot point at the wrongness. It is the feeling that civilization, the agreement we all make with each other to look away at the appropriate times, has been broken. They came out the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. By the end of that first week, we had stopped commenting on it to each other when we sat down. We would carry our plates out to the porch at 6:25, and we would sit down, and at 6:30 the screen door of the brown house across the cove would open, and the 4 of them would come down the slope, and they would arrange themselves at the water, and they would watch us eat. They did this for 14 nights in a row, every night of the rest of our stay. They never missed an evening. They never came out at any other time of day. We saw the older son take the fishing boat out one morning, and we saw the woman hang clothes on a line one afternoon, and otherwise we did not see them at all between sundown and 6:30 the next evening. They lived their lives, whatever those lives were, in the brown house, and they came out only for our supper. I went into Bryson City on that Friday and I asked the man who managed the rental about them. He was a fellow named Pete, mid-50s, who ran a real estate office on the main drag. I described the house and I described the family and I asked him if he knew them. Pete looked at me a long moment. He said, "That'd be the Tippets." He said, "They've been in that house 30-some years." I said, "Are they all right?" Pete said, "They're quiet. They don't bother nobody. They keep to themselves." I said, "They've been standing at the edge of the water every evening at 6:30 and watching us eat supper on the porch." And Pete looked at me, and he did not look surprised, and he did not look amused, and he said, "Huh." He said, "I'd ask you not to say anything to them about it." He said, "The Tippets are particular people." He said, "They had a daughter who drowned in that cove in 1989. She was 16. She was their oldest, before the boys." He said, "After she drowned, the family didn't go in the water again, and they didn't eat at their own table again. They eat in the kitchen, standing up." He said, "I don't know what they're doing standing at the water at supper time. I never heard about that. But I'd leave them be. They've had a hard life." He said it the way mountain people say a thing is finished. And I understood that the conversation was over, and I paid for my coffee and I left. We did not eat on the porch the rest of that summer. We finished out our 2 weeks eating in the kitchen, at the little table by the window that looked out at the driveway, and we did not look across the cove in the evening if we could help it. But I will tell you, on the second night that we ate inside, I happened to look out the back window of the bedroom around 6:40, and the 4 of them were standing at the edge of the water anyway. They were in their line. They were facing our porch. They were watching the empty wicker table through the screen. They stood there for about 30 minutes. Then they turned and walked back up to the house. And the same thing happened the next night, and the night after that, and every night for the rest of our 2 weeks. We were not eating out there. They watched anyway. They watched the empty table the way they had watched us, with the same patience, the same steadiness, the same quiet line of 4 bodies at the edge of the water. We did not rent the house the next summer. We rented a place at Topsail Beach instead, on the coast, and we ate on a deck that looked out at the ocean, and the only things that watched us were the gulls. But sometimes, even now, 15 years on, I will be sitting at our kitchen table at home, eating supper with Anne, and I will catch myself looking up at the back window. I will catch myself wondering if anybody is out there. I will catch myself thinking about a 16-year-old girl who went into the water in 1989 and did not come out, and about a family who built a ritual around her absence, and about what they were doing when they came down to the shore at 6:30 every evening and stood in their line of 4 where there should have been a line of 5. Whether they were watching us, whether they were watching her, whether they were standing where they used to stand when she was alive, when supper was a thing the 5 of them did together, and whether they had simply continued to stand there for 30-some years in the hope that one evening she would come back up out of the cove and join them, and they did not want to be inside the house when she did. I do not know. I will never know. But I think about them, the 4 of them in their line at the water, and I think about the empty place at the end of the line where the 5th person used to be, and I think it is the saddest thing I have ever seen in my life, and I think it is the most frightening, and I do not know how those 2 things can both be true at the same time. But in those mountains, I have learned, they very often are. We moved into the little ranch on Beechwood Drive in the summer of 2019. This summer, my husband Doug took the job at the community college in Galax, and I started teaching 4th grade at the elementary school over in Hillsville. We had been renting in Roanoke for the first 8 years of our marriage, in an apartment over a dry cleaner's, and the ranch on Beechwood was the first house we owned. It was nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, a carport instead of a garage, a backyard that ran maybe 60 feet to a chain-link fence, and then a wedge of pine woods that belonged to nobody we ever figured out. The neighborhood was the kind that had been built in the early 70s for people who worked at the furniture plants, and most of the houses on the street were still owned by the original families or by their grown children, and Doug and I were the youngest people on Beechwood by about 20 years. The neighbors on our left were a retired couple named the Pruitts who brought us a card the first week we moved in. The neighbors across the street were a widow named Mrs. Beasley who waved from her porch every time we pulled into the driveway. The neighbors on our right were the Hargises. I learned the name Hargis from the mailbox. I never learned it from them. The Hargises lived in a ranch house almost identical to ours, except theirs was painted the color of a pale yellow envelope and ours was white, and theirs had a row of boxwoods across the front that had been let go a little wild, and ours had a flower bed where I tried to grow zinnias the first summer with mixed success. They had a small gray sedan, a Toyota, I think, that they parked in the driveway and never in the carport. There were 2 of them, a man and a woman, both of them in their 40s. Both of them ordinary looking, in a way that I cannot now describe to you with any specificity, which is part of what I am trying to tell you. The man was of medium height, medium build, with brown hair cut short. He wore khaki pants and a blue button-down shirt every single day I ever saw him. The woman was a little shorter, also medium build, with brown hair she wore pulled back. She wore black slacks and a white blouse every single day I ever saw her. They got into the gray Toyota at 6:15 every morning, both of them at once, the man on the driver's side and the woman on the passenger's side, and they backed down the driveway and they drove away. They came home at 7 in the evening. The Toyota pulled into the driveway. The man got out of the driver's side. The woman got out of the passenger's side. They walked to the front door together. They went inside. The door closed. That is what I saw of my next-door neighbors for 3 years. I want to tell you about some of the other things, because the absence of them is what I started to notice first. They did not have a dog. There were dogs all up and down Beechwood Drive, because that is the kind of neighborhood it was, and the Hargises did not have one. They did not have children. There was no swing set in the backyard, no bike on the front porch, no plastic toys in the grass. They did not have visitors. In 3 years, I never saw a car other than the gray Toyota in their driveway. Not once. Not a relative at Christmas. Not a friend on a Saturday afternoon. Not a repairman. They did not have a television. I want you to understand how I knew this. Their living room window faced our living room window, across the strip of grass between our houses. And at night you can see the blue flicker of a television through curtains, even closed curtains, and there was never a flicker in their living room. Never. Not one evening in 3 years. There was never any light in their house at night at all that I could see, except for one small yellow light that came on in what I assumed was the kitchen for about an hour after they got home, and then went off, and then the house was dark until the morning. They put their trash out on Tuesday nights. They brought it back in on Wednesday mornings before they left for work. The trash bag was always the same size, a small white kitchen bag, tied at the top, never very full. They got mail. The mailbox emptied out by the time they came home. They got a Sunday paper that landed in the driveway and was inside the house by the time we left for church. The Pruitts told me, when I asked them once, casual, over the fence, that the Hargises had moved in, maybe 10 years before we did. Mrs. Pruitt said she had baked them a pound cake the week they moved in, and the woman had answered the door and thanked her and taken the cake and not invited her in, and that had been the extent of their relationship for 10 years. Mrs. Pruitt said it without any malice. She said, "Some people just keep to themselves, honey, and that's their right." She said, "They're quiet, they don't bother anybody, you couldn't ask for better neighbors, really." And I said, "That's true," and I let it drop, because Mrs. Pruitt was right. They didn't bother anybody. And Doug and I had agreed early on that we were not going to be the kind of new homeowners who poked our noses into the lives of people who clearly wanted to be left alone. But there was something. I want to be honest with you about this. There was something from very early on that I felt about the Hargises, and I could not name it, and I did not talk about it with Doug, because I knew if I tried to put it into words it would sound foolish. It was a quality of stillness about the house. It was the way the curtains never moved. It was the way I never, in 3 years, heard a sound come from inside the walls of that house. Not a phone ringing, not a voice, not music, not the hum of a window unit, even in August. Doug ran our window unit all summer, and the Pruitts ran theirs, and you could hear them all the way down the street, but the Hargises' house was silent. Silent the way a house is silent when nobody is home, except they were home. The Toyota was in the driveway every night by 7:15. It was the 3rd summer when I finally decided I was being ridiculous, and I was going to introduce myself properly. It was the 3rd week of June, a Saturday afternoon. The Toyota was in the driveway, which was unusual for a Saturday, because they were sometimes out running errands during the day on weekends, though I had never seen them come or go on a weekend in any predictable pattern. I had baked a small loaf of zucchini bread because my zinnias had finally failed and my zucchinis had finally succeeded, and I had more zucchini than 2 people could eat. I wrapped the loaf in foil and I put it on a paper plate, and I walked across the strip of grass between our houses, and I went up the 3 concrete steps to their front door, and I knocked. I want to tell you that I felt nervous knocking on that door, and I did, but not in a way I could justify. It was just a door. It was just a neighbor. I was a 31-year-old 4th grade teacher with a loaf of zucchini bread. I knocked, and I waited, and I heard nothing from inside the house for what felt like a long time, maybe 40 seconds, and I was about to turn around and go home when I heard a chain slide back, and a deadbolt turn, and a second deadbolt turn, and the knob turned, and the door opened. The man who opened the door was not the man I had been seeing get into the gray Toyota for 3 years. I want you to understand what I am telling you. The man at the door was not a similar man. He was not the same man on a different day with a different haircut. He was a different person. He was taller. He was older, maybe 60, with a full head of white hair and a beard. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He looked nothing at all, like the medium-height brown-haired man in the blue button-down who got into the driver's side of that car every morning at 6:15. I stood there with my zucchini bread on its paper plate, and I tried to make my face do a normal thing. I said, "Hi, I'm Sarah. I live next door. I just wanted to come by and finally introduce myself." The man at the door looked at me. He had pale blue eyes. He smiled, a small, polite smile that did not go up to his eyes. He said, "Well, that's neighborly of you." His voice was a deep voice, an older man's voice, with a mountain accent thick enough to cut. He took the bread from me with both hands. He said, "My wife will be tickled. She loves the zucchini bread." And then a woman came up behind him in the hallway, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and she looked at me over his shoulder, and she smiled the same small, polite smile. She was not the woman either. She was a different woman. She was older. She had gray hair and a long braid down her shoulder. She was wearing a denim dress. She did not look anything like the brown-haired woman in the white blouse who got out of the passenger's side of that car every evening at 7. I want to tell you that I said something graceful. I want to tell you that I made a polite excuse and I went home. What I actually did was stand there for what must have been 4 or 5 seconds with my mouth slightly open, and I looked from the man's face to the woman's face and back again, and the woman tilted her head a little to one side, and her smile got a little wider, and she said, "Was there something else, honey?" And her voice was not the voice I had imagined in the times I had imagined the woman's voice. It was an older voice, a country voice, and there was a little something underneath it, a little something amused, like she knew exactly what was happening on her front step, and she was waiting to see what I would do about it. I said, "No, I'm sorry. I just wanted to bring the bread." I said, "It was nice to meet you." I said, "I hope you enjoy it." And I turned around and I walked down the 3 concrete steps and across the grass to my own front door. And I went inside and I locked the door behind me, and I stood in my own front hall with my back against the door and my heart going so hard in my chest that I could feel it in my fingertips. Doug was at a faculty barbecue that afternoon. He did not get home until 5. By the time he got home, I had decided not to tell him. I do not know why I decided that. I think I knew that if I told him, he would want to do something. He would want to call somebody. He would want to figure it out, and I did not want to figure it out. I wanted to lock the door and pretend I had not gone over there. I went to the kitchen window after Doug got home, and I looked out at the Hargis's house, and the gray Toyota was still in the driveway, and the small yellow light was on in the kitchen, and everything looked exactly the way it always looked. At 7 the next morning, a Sunday, I was at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, and I watched the front door of the Hargis's house open, and I watched the man come out, the man in the blue button-down, with the brown hair cut short, the medium-height man I had been seeing for 3 years. And I watched the woman come out behind him, in the white blouse and the black slacks, with her brown hair pulled back, and they walked to the gray Toyota together, and they got in, and they drove away. And the house was still and silent behind them, and I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I do not know how long I stood there. We sold the house in October. Doug took a job at a community college outside Charlotte, and I told him I was ready for a change, and he was happy about it. And we listed the ranch on Beechwood, and we got an offer in 2 weeks, and we were gone by Thanksgiving. I never told him about the door. I never told anybody about the door, until now. I have thought about it almost every day for 7 years. I have thought about the man with the white beard taking the zucchini bread from me with both hands. I have thought about the woman with the gray braid putting her hand on his shoulder. I have thought about the smile she gave me, the slow widening of it, like she was waiting. I have wondered, every day, who lived in that house. I have wondered who got into that car at 6:15 every morning, and who got out of it at 7 every night, for 10 years before we moved in, and for however long after we moved out. I have wondered whether the man and the woman I met at the door had been there the whole time, in the back of that house, in a room I could not see from any window of mine, while 2 other people came and went on a schedule. And I have wondered sometimes, in the middle of the night, whether the man and the woman in the Toyota knew, whether they knew who was in the back of the house, whether they knew what they were going home to every evening at 7, whether they were going home to it at all, or whether they were just driving, the 2 of them, to that yellow house at the end of the day because that was what they had been told to do by somebody a long time ago, and they did not remember anymore why.